From a humble settlement of shepherds beside the Tiber River to the marble forums of Rome, from legions marching across continents to emperors cloaked in power and paranoia. This is the story of the Roman Empire. As always, I'd love to know where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it for you? Whether you're lying in the dark, eyes heavy with sleep, or quietly escaping into the past, this moment is yours. Breathe deep. Get comfortable. Let your mind drift across time. This is a story over 2,000 years in the making. And tonight, it's all yours. Let's begin. It begins in the shadow of the Palatine Hill, where mist still clings to the earth, in the early light of a world not yet formed into empire. The Tiber River murmurs through the lowlands, its slow current winding around the floodplains that will one day bear the weight of marble forums, towering columns, and the heavy footfall of centurions. But now, in this prelude to history, there are only soft reeds brushing the banks and the quiet breathing of wilderness. Before Rome could rise, there was a story, a legend told and retold until it rooted itself so deeply into the soil of Italy that even the most skeptical voices could not pull it free. The story speaks of twin boys born of a priestess named Rhea Silvia. She was a Vestal virgin sworn to chastity by the command of her uncle King Amulius, who feared any challenge to his throne. But fate, it seems, cannot be avoided by decree. The god Mars, cloaked in divine silence, came to Rhea and left her with sons, Romulus and Remi. The king, upon hearing of their birth, ordered them cast into the river. The order was followed. The twins were placed in a basket and left to die in the muddy current of the Tiber. But the river was swollen and sluggish from spring rains, and the current deposited the basket safely in the shallows. There, near the roots of a fig tree, a she-wolf found them. She was not a creature of horror, as later stories would make her. She was a mother with no pups of her own. Her fur was bristled and her breath warm, and she took the boys into her den beneath the Palatine. There she nursed them, and they lived. The shepherd Faustulus later found them and brought them into his home. The twins grew among flocks and fields, unaware of the bloodlines that coiled through their veins. They were bold and stubborn and unafraid of struggle. As young men, they learned the truth of their lineage and helped their grandfather reclaim his rightful throne in Alba Longa. They might have stayed, but they didn't. Something pulled them back to the wilderness near the river. That stretch of land near the 7 hills called to them, and they answered with ambition. They decided to build a new city. But even in the beginning, Rome was forged in conflict. The twins could not agree on where to lay the first stone or who would lead. Romulus favored the Palatine Hill. Remi preferred the Aventine. They consulted omens. Romulus saw more birds. Remi claimed he saw them first. The argument ended with blood in the dirt. Remi was killed. Whether by Romulus himself or by one of his men, the stories differ, but the result was the same. One brother lived. One brother ruled. The survivor drew a line in the earth, marked the limits of his walls, and began to build. No one could cross the sacred boundary without death, he declared. The message was clear. The city would be defended, even if that meant slaying kin. The date given by tradition was April 21st, 753 years before the birth of Christ. That year was remembered not because of the stones or the borders, but because of the will behind them. Romulus named the city after himself and became its first king. Around him, the new city grew in rough circles. Simple huts, wooden palisades, and early temples to unknown gods. Men from nearby tribes were drawn to the place, and when few women followed, Romulus orchestrated the infamous Sabine abduction. During a feast, the Romans seized the daughters of the neighboring Sabines and forced them to marry. The act was brutal, but it stitched two peoples together. The Sabine men were eventually reconciled, and the city expanded again. In the decades that followed, Romulus continued to rule, but legends say his end was as mysterious as his beginning. One day, he vanished in a storm, taken up into the sky. His followers believed he had become a god. Whether that was true or not, his city remained. Rome had been born in violence, shaped by ambition, and claimed by divine favor. It would not be the last time that myth and reality blurred, or that the boundaries of empire would be drawn with a sword. But for now, it was still only a village by a river, breathing in the silence before history began to speak. The city that Romulus founded did not remain a solitary dream for long. Rome grew not only in the number of its citizens, but in the complexity of its identity. It became a city of mingled tribes and uneasy alliances, a place where new laws tried to tame old instincts. Romulus ruled as king until his strange disappearance, and though he was later worshipped as the god Quirinus, his departure left the throne behind. Others would sit upon it. Rome would not yet be a republic or an empire. For more than 200 years, it would be ruled by kings. According to Roman tradition, 7 kings ruled in sequence. The names of some are etched into the foundation stones of legend. The second king, Numa Pompilius, was a Saban said to be wise and deeply pious. While Romulus had built walls and forged weapons, Numa turned his attention to temples and time. He shaped the early calendar, created priestly offices, and taught the people to offer sacrifice and keep peace when war was not required. The rituals he established were said to be handed down from the gods themselves. Whether true or not, the people believed. The city became more than a military outpost. It became a place of rhythm and tradition, a society slowly learning the meaning of order. Other kings followed, each leaving marks that would endure. Tullus Hostilius, third of the kings, rejected peace and gloried in conquest. He destroyed the rival city of Alba Longa and transferred its nobles to Rome, expanding the Senate. Ancus Marcus built bridges across the Tiber and extended Roman influence westward. Rome was no longer a village. It was becoming a city of roads and ritual, warriors and artisans, a community bound together by shared ambition. The monarchy had power, but it was not absolute. A council of elders, the Senate, advised the king. The people were divided into tribes and curia and participated in assemblies, even if their voices were small. In time, Rome began to change more rapidly. The last 3 kings were said to be of Etruscan origin. The Etruscans lived to the north and brought with them new ideas in engineering, religion, and symbolism. Under King Tarquinius Priscus, the Circus Maximus was begun. With Servius Tullus, the city was divided into districts. Census records were kept, and the military was reorganized into centuries. Servius was said to be born of a slave woman and rose to power through merit. His rule was long and filled with reform, but it ended in blood as many reigns did. He was murdered by his son-in-law, a man who would become the last king of Rome. Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, remembered only as Tarquin the Proud, took the throne not by consent, but by force. He ruled with cruelty and suspicion. He abolished many rights that his predecessors had protected and governed without the Senate's blessing. His projects were ambitious, including the construction of the massive temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill. But his methods were ruthless. His downfall did not come from battle or foreign invasion, but from within his own house. According to the tradition, his son Sextus Tarquinius committed a brutal act against a noble woman named Lucretia. Her public suicide in response to the violation ignited outrage among Rome's leading families. One of them, Lucius Junius Brutus, led a revolt. The people rose. The king was expelled. His family was cast out, and the monarchy itself was declared finished. In its place, the Romans established a new form of government, one that rejected kingship and entrusted power to magistrates elected by citizens. The Republic had begun, though its early years would be fragile. The memory of the kings would linger, a mixture of respect for order and deep distrust of tyranny. For centuries after, no Roman would dare claim the title of king without facing hatred and rebellion. They remembered the end too well. The age of the kings had shaped them, but it had also taught them what power could do when held too tightly. So the crown was broken and the sword passed to the people. Or so they believed. The story of Rome was only beginning, but already its rhythm was set. Glory born of violence, greatness shaped by struggle, and always the desire to build something that would outlive its founders. The monarchy had fallen, and in its place rose an idea, fragile and untested, carried more by hope than certainty. It was called a republic, a public thing, a republic. And it was designed not to honor kings, but to replace them with men who held power only for a moment before giving it back. Where once there had been a single crown, there were now 2 consuls elected annually, each with equal authority, their movements shadowed by the silent caution of the other. The Senate remained as an advisory body of Rome's elders, and assemblies were created to give voice to the citizens. Though not all voices weighed equally, it was a system that was orderly on parchment, but real power is never so neat. And Rome, now a republic in name, would spend its earliest years struggling to decide what that truly meant. The republic's greatest enemy in these early decades was not Carthage, not Gaul. Not some distant army marching from the east, but the bitter tension that simmered between the patricians and the plebeians. The patricians were the old families, the landowners, the ones whose fathers and grandfathers had advised kings, and who now filled the ranks of the Senate, believing it was their birthright to govern. The plebeians were everyone else, the farmers and artisans and soldiers, who bled for the city, but found themselves barred from holding office, forbidden from marrying into noble families, and locked out of the laws that governed them. These laws were not written, only spoken, guarded like a secret language by the elite. And so the Republic, born of rebellion, found itself lurching from one internal crisis to the next. As the plebeians fought for recognition in a state that expected their loyalty, but did not yet grant them equality, the first great demand came as a refusal. In 494 BCE, the plebeians walked out. They left the city, climbed a hill outside Rome's walls, and refused to return unless granted the right to representation. It was a bold act in a time when unity meant survival, and the patricians, faced with the threat of a city without its workers and soldiers, gave in. The office of the tribune of the plebs was created, and these tribunes, sacrosanct and untouchable, were empowered to protect the people and to veto unjust measures from the Senate or the consuls. It was a victory, but only the first of many needed. The struggle continued for generations. The plebeians demanded that laws be written down, that justice be visible, that the privileges of the few be balanced by the needs of the many. In time, they won the 12 Tables, Rome's first code of laws, etched into bronze and displayed in the Forum, so that no citizen, high or low, could claim ignorance or be bound by invisible rules. These victories were hard won and never complete. Power once held is rarely surrendered without resistance. Patrician families adapted, sometimes giving up small concessions while strengthening their grip elsewhere. The plebeians gained access to new offices, but the path to true parity was long and uneven. Still, the foundations were being laid. Through protest and patience, Rome was shaping itself into a republic not of perfection, but of persistence. It was learning slowly that stability must be earned, not inherited, and that greatness does not grow in silence, but in argument, in pressure, and in compromise. Beyond the walls of the city, other challenges pressed in. Rome was not the only city-state on the Italian peninsula. It was one among many, a neighbor to rival tribes and proud peoples who would not easily yield. Rome fought the Latins, battled the Sabines and the Vuli, and learned the brutal rhythms of constant war. In 390 BCE, disaster struck. A Greek army from the north descended upon the city, and the Roman defenses crumbled. The Senate was slaughtered. The sacred geese of Juno, according to the tale, squawked and shrieked as Gauls climbed the Capitoline Hill under cover of darkness. Rome was sacked, its streets filled with fire and blood, and the survivors paid a ransom in gold to buy the city's freedom. It was a wound that would never fully heal, a humiliation that hardened Roman resolve. From the ashes, the Romans rebuilt. They fortified their walls, reformed their army, and vowed that such shame would never be repeated. The Republic endured. It staggered and adapted, fractured and reformed. In the space of a few generations, it became a city no longer ruled by kings, but not yet ruled by law alone. It was an organism of change, a body politic that grew stronger by breaking and repairing itself again and again. Its citizens argued, marched, rebelled, and served. The legions were taking shape. The offices were multiplying. And the dream of a republic, still unclear in its final form, continued to pulse beneath the surface of every law, every sword, and every stone laid in the growing city of Rome. The city of Rome did not grow because it was destined to. It grew because it fought. The hills and valleys of the Italian peninsula were not empty, nor were they waiting to be ruled. They were already claimed by old cities and older traditions, by proud mountain tribes, coastal Greeks and Etruscan kings who had ruled before Rome had even been born. Rome did not conquer Italy in a single sweep, nor did it absorb its neighbors with the ease that later poets would pretend. It fought for every mile, and the story of Rome's rise from a struggling city to the master of all Italy is a slow, bruising record of wars that wore down armies and reshaped identities. Each battle leaving behind the foundations of something larger than what had come before. At first, the struggle was for survival. After the GIC sack in 390 BCE, Rome hardened its borders and began to look beyond them. Its early expansion was not the methodical spread of an empire, but a series of tangled conflicts, retaliations, broken treaties, and territorial skirmishes. Cities that submitted could keep their local governments, their gods, and their festivals. In return, they gave soldiers. They gave loyalty. And over time they gave in. To the east, the fierce Semites controlled the rugged mountains of central Italy. Rome and the Semites would clash again and again in a series of long and exhausting wars. The Semites were tenacious and skilled at guerrilla warfare, ambushing Roman legions in narrow valleys and rocky passes. In one of the most humiliating defeats of Roman history, Roman soldiers were forced to pass under a symbolic yoke after surrendering at the Cordon Forks. When Rome's growing influence threatened the independence of the city of Tarentum, the Greeks appealed to a savior from across the sea. King Pius of Epirus answered the call. A descendant of Alexander the Great's generals, Pius arrived with elephants, trained phalanxes, and the confidence of someone who had won wars before. He met the Romans in battle and won, but each victory came with devastating losses. After several costly engagements, he looked back on his victories and said that one more such triumph would ruin him. His campaign collapsed under the weight of its own ambition. The Romans, battered but unbroken, remained. By the middle of the 3rd century BCE, there was no power in Italy capable of challenging Rome's authority. The Samnites were subdued. The Etruscan cities had been absorbed. The Greek colonies one by one had either surrendered or been taken. But Rome did not impose a single model of governance across the peninsula. Instead, it wove a patchwork system of colonies, treaties, and citizenship rights. Some cities were granted full Roman citizenship. Others were given partial rights. Still others remained formally independent, but were bound to Rome through military obligations. This uneven system was not a mistake. It was a design meant to keep cities loyal to Rome, but isolated from one another, unable to organize any united resistance. With Italy secured, Rome had more soldiers than ever before. It had roads that connected its colonies, legions trained through constant conflict, and a sense of destiny growing inside its people like fire under stone. But there was more than just destiny ahead. There was wealth, opportunity, and danger across the sea. To the south, Carthage ruled the waters and the trade routes. Its ships patrolled the coasts of Sicily. Its merchants stretched from Spain to North Africa. Rome's expansion into Italy had brought it to the very edge of another world power. The wars of the peninsula were finished. The wars of empire were about to begin. The wars of Italy had taught Rome how to endure, how to bleed without breaking, how to bind a people together, not through unity of birth or culture, but through shared law, shared purpose, and the promise of belonging in something larger than the self. But across the sea, another power had been rising just as steadily, built not on legions, but on sails, not on conquest by land, but on wealth gathered from the deep. The city of Carthage stood on the coast of North Africa, its harbors filled with merchant ships, and its walls strong enough to withstand any land army. It was a city of traders and admirals, of markets and temples, of fierce independence and quiet ambition. Its reach extended across the western Mediterranean, and for a time, Rome and Carthage had existed in a state of weary tolerance, each aware of the other's strength, but content to grow in opposite directions. That peace would not last. The island of Sicily lay between them, a land of rich fields and strategic harbors, and it would become the spark that ignited a century of war. In the middle of the 3rd century BCE, a small mercenary group seized the Sicilian city of Messana and found themselves caught between larger forces. Carthage arrived first, offering to restore order. Rome, seeing a Carthaginian foothold so close to the Italian coast, could not ignore the threat. The Senate debated, and with some reluctance, sent legions across the strait. It was a decision made in caution, but it would draw Rome into its first true war beyond the peninsula. The First Punic War had begun. It was a conflict neither side had fully prepared for. Carthage dominated the sea, and Rome had little experience in naval warfare. But the Romans, as always, learned quickly. They built ships modeled after captured Carthaginian vessels, trained crews with relentless discipline, and developed a boarding device called the corvus that turned sea, battles into hand-to-hand struggles more familiar to Roman soldiers. For more than 2 decades, the war dragged on. Rome won battles, then lost fleets to storms. Carthage countered with its superior navy, but struggled to hold territory inland. Cities changed hands, alliances shifted, and the island of Sicily became a graveyard for thousands. In the end, it was Rome's resilience that prevailed. In 241 BCE, after a final naval victory at the Battle of the Egert's Islands, Carthage sued for peace. Rome imposed harsh terms. Sicily became Rome's first overseas province. The Republic had stepped beyond Italy and claimed foreign soil as its own. But peace with Carthage was shallow, and time did not heal the wounds. When Carthage turned its attention to Spain, hoping to rebuild its power through new conquests in silver mines, Rome watched with suspicion. Tensions grew with every campaign. The final blow came not from Rome, but from a Carthaginian general whose name would become etched into Roman memory with fire. Hannibal Barca, son of a commander from the First War, took an oath in childhood to never make peace with Rome. In 218 BCE, he acted on that vow. Leading a multinational army from Spain, Hannibal crossed the Pyrenees, forded rivers, and did what no Roman thought possible. He led his forces across the Alps and descended into Italy, bringing war directly to the heart of the Republic. It was not only an invasion, it was a masterstroke of strategy. Hannibal's army, battered and diminished from the mountains, still managed to win battle after battle. At the Trebia River, at Lake Tryme, at the horrific plain of Cana, he outmaneuvered and annihilated Roman legions. Tens of thousands died in a single day at Cana, a circle of death so complete that even hardened commanders lost hope. Cities in the south of Italy defected. Panic gripped Rome, but the Republic did not surrender. It adapted. Under the cautious leadership of Fabius Maximus, Rome avoided open battle and harassed Hannibal's supply lines. Hannibal remained in Italy for more than a decade, undefeated but isolated, a threat that Rome could not crush or refuse to bow before. Meanwhile, Rome fought elsewhere. In Spain, young generals rose to prominence. One of them, Publius Cornelius Scipio, proved himself a brilliant commander. He captured New Carthage, drove Carthaginian forces from the Iberian Peninsula, and brought the war to North Africa. In 202 BCE, at the Battle of Zama, Scipio and Hannibal met for the first and only time. It was a reversal of Canaan. This time, it was the Roman strategy that prevailed. Hannibal's elephants were turned against him. His infantry, worn and outnumbered, could not withstand the Roman legions. Carthage was defeated. Hannibal survived, but the war was lost. Rome imposed even harsher terms than before, stripping Carthage of its fleet and its independence in foreign policy. Scipio was given the title Africanes, and Rome stood supreme in the western Mediterranean. The Second Punic War had shaken the Republic to its core, but it had also proven something essential about Roman identity. Victory was not born from brilliance alone. It came from stubbornness, from an ability to endure disaster and keep fighting, from a system that could lose battles but never lose its will. Rome had not only survived Hannibal, it had learned from him, and that knowledge would shape the next phase of its ascent. Rome had emerged from the Second Punic War, not only victorious, but transformed. It had faced one of the greatest generals in history, lost more men than could be counted, seen its fields burned, and its alliances strained to the breaking point, and still it had endured. But the Republic that now ruled was no longer the same creature that had once fought for survival in the hills of Latium. It was larger, more confident, and increasingly unafraid of expanding into foreign lands. The wars against Carthage had trained its people to think beyond their own peninsula, and with that shift came a new appetite, not just for defense or survival, but for dominance. The Mediterranean, once a sea divided among competing cultures and rival powers, was now beginning to take on the shape of a Roman lake. The Republic was not yet an empire, but it was behaving like one. The remnants of Carthaginian power still flickered after Zama, but they burned low, and Rome kept a watchful eye on every spark. Carthage had been stripped of its navy, forbidden from waging war without Rome's consent, and crushed under a heavy burden of tribute. Yet it remained a trading city, prosperous in commerce and rich in agriculture. For a generation, it paid its debts faithfully and posed no threat. But prosperity itself became an irritant. There were senators in Rome who believed that Carthage should not be allowed to recover. Chief among them was Cato the Elder, who ended every speech, regardless of topic, with the same grim refrain that Carthage must be destroyed. In 149 B.C.E., when Carthage responded with force against an African neighbor in self-defense, Rome seized the opportunity. War was declared once again. The Third Punic War was less a battle than an execution. Rome sent an army not to negotiate, but to destroy. Carthage resisted fiercely, withstanding a brutal siege that lasted 3 years. Families starved. Fires raged in the streets. When Roman forces finally broke through, they fought house by house, dragging survivors into slavery and killing those who resisted. The city was leveled. According to legend, The land was salted to prevent anything from growing, though that part may be poetic invention. But Carthage was only one part of the Mediterranean story. While it had dominated the west, Greece and the Hellenistic kingdoms ruled the east. Macedonia, the homeland of Alexander the Great, had once controlled a vast empire stretching to the edge of India. After his death, his generals carved up his conquests into competing realms. By the 2 North century BCE, these kingdoms still wielded considerable influence, but they had also grown complacent. Rome, fresh from its victories in the west, turned its gaze eastward. At first, it claimed only to protect allies, but protection soon became interference, and interference led to war. The Macedonian Wars were a series of conflicts that allowed Rome to insert itself deeper into Greek politics with each passing decade. When Macedon resisted Roman pressure, war was declared. When Greek cities rose up in revolt, Rome responded with force. By 146 BCE, the same year that Carthage was destroyed, Rome also crushed Corinth, the heart of Greek commerce. Statues were looted, temples burned. The treasures of Hellenic civilization were packed onto Roman ships and carried west. Greece, once the teacher of Rome in art and philosophy, had become a province. The symmetry of that year was impossible to ignore. In a matter of months, 2 ancient powers, Carthage in the west and Greece in the east, had been brought to ruin. Rome stood alone. What followed was not a formal declaration of empire, but an imperial reality. Provinces were established in Spain, in North Africa, in Greece. In Asia Minor, governors were appointed to oversee them, some just and disciplined, others corrupt and greedy. The wealth of the world poured into Rome: gold, slaves, spices, art, grain. Senators returned from distant campaigns with fortunes unimaginable to their fathers. Villas multiplied along the Italian countryside. The city itself expanded, its population swelling, its buildings rising in marble and ambition. The Forum filled with monuments to victory. Triumphs marched through the streets, celebrating generals who had pushed Rome's frontiers farther than ever before. Yet, even as Rome mastered the Mediterranean, cracks had begun to form beneath its foundation. The armies were changing. Once composed of citizen soldiers who returned home to their fields, they were now fighting in distant lands for years at a time. And those who returned often found their farms ruined or sold to pay debts. The rich grew richer, buying up the land and working it with slaves captured in conquest. The poor crowded into the city, dependent on grain dolls and resentful of a system that seemed to serve only the powerful. The Senate, filled with men who claimed to serve the Republic, often served only themselves. Rome had conquered the world, but it was beginning to lose control of itself. The Mediterranean was quiet for now. The pirates had been swept away. The rival powers had been defeated or absorbed. From Spain to Syria, from Gaul to Egypt, the shadow of Rome stretched wide. But that shadow was no longer cast only outward. It had begun to fall across the Republic itself. The wars to come would not be fought across oceans. They would be fought at home. The empire had grown faster than its people could manage. What had begun as a city of farmers and soldiers, organized into tribes and bound by shared rituals, had become a state stretched across seas and deserts. A state whose administrators could no longer see its borders from any hilltop. Victory had brought silver, grain, and slaves in overwhelming abundance. But it had also brought imbalance. The Roman Republic, so carefully designed to keep power rotating between offices and social classes, found itself swaying under the weight of its own success. The Senate still met and debated. The assemblies still voted. But behind the ceremonies, something was shifting. The gap between rich and poor had grown too wide, and now it began to split the foundations of the state. The countryside was the first to show the fracture. When Roman citizens had gone to fight abroad, they had left behind farms, families, and livelihoods. But while they fought, their land was often seized by creditors or left to decay in their absence. The great estates, owned by aristocrats who had grown wealthy on war plunder, expanded across the Italian hillsides. These latifundia were worked not by citizens, but by slaves. Many of them captured during Rome's wars in Greece, Spain, and Africa. The free farmers who had once been the backbone of the Republic returned home to find themselves dispossessed. With no land to till and no future to claim, they poured into the city, forming a restless mass of veterans. And laborers who were no longer bound to the old values of the Republic, who now relied on grain distributions and promises from ambitious politicians who claimed to speak in their name. Into this volatile landscape stepped the brothers Tiberius and Gas, born into a noble family, but raised with a deep sense of duty to the people. The Gracchi believed the Republic could be healed if only it returned to its roots. In 133 BCE, Tiberius, as tribune of the plebs, proposed a bold land reform. Public land that had been illegally seized by the wealthy would be redistributed to the poor, giving citizens a chance to rebuild their lives. It was a plan rooted in law, but it was met with fury. The Senate, threatened by the loss of property and power, resisted. Tiberius bypassed them. He brought his reforms directly to the people, challenging the norms of Roman politics and igniting outrage among the elite. When he sought re-election to the tribunate, a move seen as dangerously close to monarchy, his enemies acted. He was attacked and killed during a riot on the Capitoline Hill. His body was thrown into the Tiber without ceremony. The message was clear. Rome could tolerate hunger and injustice, but it would not tolerate challenge to its traditions. 10 years later, Gasgras took up his brother's cause. He was more charismatic, more organized, and even more ambitious. He proposed a wide set of reforms: land distribution, subsidized grain, citizenship rights for Italian allies, and judicial reforms to weaken senatorial control of the courts. His speeches drew massive crowds. His proposals gained momentum. But again, resistance grew. The Senate, now more cautious, did not move against him directly. Instead, it empowered rival tribunes and waited for public opinion to shift. When violence finally erupted between his supporters and the state, the Senate passed the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, a final decree authorizing any force necessary to protect the Republic. Gas fled. Surrounded on a wooded slope across the river, he asked a slave to take his life before the state could. His head was taken as a trophy. His followers were hunted and executed. Reform had ended in blood once again. The deaths of the Gracchi were more than political defeats. They marked the beginning of a new age in Roman politics, one where violence was no longer a last resort, but a tool of persuasion. The Senate had shown it would kill to preserve its power, and future politicians learned to wield fear just as effectively. New figures emerged: generals who courted the masses, commanders who promised their soldiers not just pay but land, glory, and security in return for loyalty. One of them was Gas Marius, a man from humble origins who rose through military achievement. He reformed the army, opening its ranks to the landless poor, who in turn became more loyal to him than to the state. His victories in North Africa and against barbarian invaders from the north made him a hero. His rise to power through repeated consulships made him a warning. The old traditions had said no man should hold such authority for so long. But the traditions were breaking. Marius had shown that if the people supported you, and if the legions followed you, the old rules no longer mattered. Soon after came Sulla, an aristocrat turned general, a man who saw in Marius a rival and in the Republic a weapon to be used. When conflict broke out over command of a military campaign in the east, Sulla marched his army on Rome itself, an act that had never been done before. He entered the city not as a statesman, but as a conqueror. He seized power, drove Marius into exile, and appointed himself dictator. When Marius returned, the city was soaked again in blood. Political enemies were hunted, their names posted on public lists, their property seized, their families destroyed. When Sulla regained control, he did the same, but more ruthlessly. He claimed to be restoring the Republic, but his methods had torn it apart. After years of violence, he retired from public life, leaving behind a government that was technically intact, but spiritually broken. The Republic had survived the Punic Wars, survived Hannibal, survived centuries of external threats. But now it was at war with itself. The streets were no longer safe. The elections were no longer honest. The Senate no longer ruled. It merely reacted. And somewhere quietly and inevitably, the idea of Rome as a republic, of shared power and citizen governance, was beginning to fade. The people had started to look not to the law, but to the strong. They were looking for someone who could bring order, even if it came with a crown. Amid the broken promises of the Republic and the blood that had soaked the Forum stones, a new figure began to rise. His name had already echoed in Roman ears for generations. Caesar, a name descended from a noble patrician house, a name with claims to ancient gods and royal ancestors. But for most of his early life, Gaius Julius Caesar had little more than a name and ambition. He had grown up in the shadows of political purges, watched his allies fall to Sulla's prescriptions, and learned that power in Rome came not from tradition, but from timing, from influence, and most of all, from risk. He was charming, eloquent, brilliant, and tireless. He studied rhetoric, mastered law, served in the military, and climbed each rung of Roman political life with a calculated hunger that was as deliberate as it was patient. He understood the Republic not as something sacred, but as a game, and he intended to win it. Caesar aligned himself with the popular, the faction that claimed to represent the common people, though many of its champions were themselves aristocrats. He courted the urban poor with promises of reform, entertained the masses with games, and cultivated an image that blended humility with grandeur. But he did not rise alone. Rome was no longer a place where one man could succeed without allies. Caesar formed a political alliance with two of the most powerful figures of the time. Each man had his needs. Together, they intended to control Rome from behind the curtain. In 59 BCE, Caesar was elected consul. He used his position to pass laws that favored his allies and challenged the Senate's authority. The old guard fumed, but they could not stop him. When his term ended, he secured a military command in Gaul, the broad, wild land that stretched beyond the Alps and was home to dozens of tribes that had long resisted Roman control. What followed was one of the most remarkable campaigns in Roman history. For nearly a decade, Caesar fought and conquered in Gaul, defeating coalition after coalition, crossing rivers, building fortifications, and bending the region to Rome's will. He crossed into Britain, the edge of the known world, and returned with stories that only deepened his legend. He wrote detailed accounts of his campaigns, sending them back to Rome, where they were read aloud like epics. The people loved him. His soldiers adored him. His enemies feared him. And all the while, he grew more powerful than any Roman had ever been without wearing a crown. But power cannot be shared indefinitely. Crowds died in battle in the East, trying to match Caesar's glory. Pompey left in Rome grew distant and suspicious. The Senate, led by Caesar's rivals, sought to strip him of command and bring him to trial. They feared what he had become. They feared what he might do. Caesar was ordered to return to Rome, but only if he left his army behind. It was a line drawn not in law, but in fear. And Caesar, who knew better than anyone that crossing lines was how power was claimed, made his decision. In 49 BCE, he led his army across the Rubicon River, a shallow stream that marked the boundary between his province and Italy proper. It was an act of treason. It was also a declaration. He had chosen civil war over submission. According to tradition, as he crossed the river, he said the words that would echo for centuries. The die is cast. Rome erupted into chaos. Pompey fled to the east, gathering an army in Greece. Caesar pursued him across the sea. The two men who had once stood side by side as allies now faced one another on the battlefield. At Pharsalus in 48 BCE, Caesar's forces crushed Pompey's despite being outnumbered. Pompey escaped to Egypt, where he was murdered by a local court, hoping to please the victor. Caesar arrived soon after and was presented with Pompey's severe head. He did not smile. He wept. Whether out of sorrow or strategy, no one could say for certain. He lingered in Egypt, entangling himself in the dynastic struggles of the Ptolemies and aligning himself with Cleopatra, a brilliant and charismatic queen who would become his lover and the mother of his only known son. Together they traveled the Nile. Together they dreamed of what might come next. When Caesar returned to Rome, there was no one left to oppose him. He was appointed dictator first for a year, then for 10, then for life. He reformed the calendar, revived the Senate with new members, planned colonies for veterans, and introduced laws meant to ease debt and control grain supply. He refused to act like a king, but he accepted honors that blurred the difference. Statues were raised. His image was printed on coins. He sat on a golden chair in the Senate, wore a purple robe, and answered only to himself. The Republic had become a memory, and in that memory, resentment stirred. On the Ides of March, the 15th day of the Roman month in 44 BCE, Caesar entered the Senate House, unaware or unwilling to believe the danger that awaited him. A group of senators, many of them former allies, gathered around him with concealed blades. They stabbed him one after another more than 20 times. He fell at the foot of a statue of Pompey, the man he had once defeated, and died with no final words that history could confirm. The conspirators thought they had saved the Republic. Instead, they opened. Its final wound. Caesar's death did not restore the old order. It shattered what little remained. Rome would bleed again, this time not over policy or law, but over the question of who would rule the ruins he left behind. In the weeks that followed Caesar's murder, the streets of Rome filled with murmurs and unease. The conspirators had believed the Republic would spring back to life, but the Republic no longer breathed on its own. It had become a fragile memory, too battered by years of corruption and violence to reassemble itself simply because a tyrant had fallen. The Senate had no plan beyond Caesar's death. The people, shocked and uncertain, did not cheer. They grieved. They poured into the forum where Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal general and fellow consul, stood before them with fire in his voice and grief in his eyes. He read Caesar's will aloud. He named Caesar's heir. He showed them the bloodied cloak. And with every word, the crowd shifted from confusion to fury. Rome did not rise to restore the Republic. It rose to avenge Caesar. The man named in Caesar's will as his adopted son and political successor was not a celebrated general or a seasoned senator. He was a teenager. His name was Gaius Octavius, and at the time of Caesar's death, he was in Greece, completing his studies and gathering no particular fame. But when he received the news and the name, he did not hesitate. He crossed the sea, entered Rome with quiet confidence, and began to gather allies. He was young, but not foolish. He did not attack the Senate. He did not shout or boast. He negotiated. He watched. He waited. And when the moment was right, he joined forces with Mark Antony and Marcus Lepidus to form a new ruling alliance, a second triumvirate given legal power by the state to crush the assassins and restore order. Together, they hunted down Brutus and Cassius, the leaders of the conspiracy, and defeated them at the Battle of Philippi in 42. BCE, the men who had tried to save the Republic ended their lives by their own hands on a distant battlefield, far from the city they had hoped to preserve. But no alliance in Rome was built to last. Octavian and Antony soon turned on one another, their rivalry growing more dangerous with every province they claimed. Antony settled in the east, where he fell further under the influence of Cleopatra. Their union was both romantic and political, and it stirred deep suspicion in Rome. Octavian stayed in the west, consolidating his power, portraying himself as the guardian of Roman tradition and quietly preparing for the inevitable confrontation. The Senate, weary of civil war and hungry for stability, backed the man who promised to defend Roman values. The Eastern Empire adapted. It shrank when it had to. It fortified its cities and restructured its armies. It watched as new faiths rose and challenged its borders. The rise of Islam in the 7th century changed everything. The armies of the Arab Caliphate swept across the old Roman provinces of the East, taking Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and North Africa. They moved swiftly, carried by fire and belief. The Eastern Empire lost territory after territory, but it did not break. Constantinople stood. Its walls held firm. Its emperors endured. They no longer ruled the world, but they ruled themselves, and in doing so, kept the Roman light burning in the eastern sky. The people of Constantinople continued to believe in their empire. They prayed to saints, lit candles beneath golden icons, and debated theology with the same intensity that earlier generations had debated politics. They called their emperor Basileus, and he stood as both ruler and protector of the faith. The church and the state had become inseparable, and together they shaped a culture unlike anything in the world. Byzantine art glowed with gold and mystery. Byzantine diplomacy moved with careful patience. Byzantine survival depended not only on armies, but on understanding the delicate balance of war, marriage, religion, and trade. For centuries, this empire stood between Europe and the rising powers of the East. It was a shield, a mirror, a memory made real. And through it all, the name of Rome remained, engraved in stone, whispered in prayer, carried in language and law. The old capital had faded, but the idea lived on. It lived in every citizen who called himself Roman. It lived in every law written in the emperor's name. It lived in every morning when the bells of Hagia Sophia rang across the city and reminded the world that though time had passed, the empire was not yet finished. The Eastern Roman Empire had endured storms that would have drowned lesser powers. It had bent, but not broken beneath invasions, rebellions, plagues, and religious upheaval. Its people had watched the world change around them, watched kingdoms rise and fall, watched the map of Europe shift like sand in the wind. But still they called themselves Romans. Still they gathered beneath their golden domes and chanted hymns in the shadow of mosaics that gleamed like sunlight caught in stone. They believed their city was eternal. They believed their walls would never fall. And for centuries, it seemed they might be right. But no empire lasts forever. Not even one that has outlived its twin. Not even one guarded by 3 rings of walls and the deepest harbor in the known world. The decline of Constantinople was not sudden. It was a slow fading, a loss of breath that stretched across generations. By the 11th century, the empire had grown smaller and more fragile. Its armies were no longer the disciplined ranks of old. Its economy staggered beneath the weight of war and trade imbalances. The rise of the Seljuk Turks in the east pushed against its borders. Anatolia, once the heartland of Roman grain and soldiers, slipped from imperial control. Defeats on the battlefield began to feel permanent. Resources drained away, and with them the confidence that had once filled the marble streets of the capital. Then came the moment that shattered more than territory. In 1204, during the Fourth Crusade, An army of Latin Christians from Western Europe turned their swords not against the Muslims of the Holy Land, but against the city of Constantinople itself. Enticed by politics, greed, and broken promises, they attacked the city they had sworn to protect. They breached the walls. They looted the churches. They burned the libraries. And for 3 days, the Queen of Cities was reduced to ash and screams. Holy relics were taken. Gold was melted. Monks were slaughtered. Women were dragged from sanctuaries. It was not just a defeat. It was a humiliation. And it was delivered not by foreign enemies, but by those who claimed the same faith. The empire was carved into pieces, ruled by Western lords who did not understand its language, its laws, or its soul. But even then, it was not truly dead. In 1261, Byzantine forces recaptured the city and restored imperial rule. The emperors returned. The liturgies resumed. The mosaics were repaired. But something essential had been lost. Constantinople had survived, but it had been wounded beyond healing. The years that followed were years of survival. The empire was now a shadow of its former self, confined to the city and a few scattered territories in Greece. The emperors were no longer rulers of a vast dominion. They were guardians of a relic, stewards of a legacy that stretched back to Augustus and Romulus, but could no longer command armies or shape the course of nations. And while the empire withered, a new power rose. The Ottoman Turks, forged in Anatolia, organized and relentless, moved ever closer to the heart of the Byzantine world. They conquered city after city, province after province, until only Constantinople remained. The walls were still strong, the spirit was still proud, but the numbers no longer mattered. The armies no longer matched. The Ottomans surrounded the city with cannons and siege towers. In the spring of 1453, Sultan Mehmed II began his final assault. For 53 days, the defenders of Constantinople resisted. Citizens, monks, soldiers, and foreign volunteers fought side by side along the walls. The city prayed in churches, sang from rooftops, and waited for a miracle. But no miracle came. On the 29th of May, the walls were breached. The gates were overwhelmed, and the last emperor, Constantine the Finland, descendant of a line that stretched back more than 1,000 years, died sword in hand at the final barricade. His body was never found. The city fell. The great cathedral of Hagia Sophia was emptied, its altar stripped, its bells silenced. Then it was consecrated again, not as a Christian basilica, but as a mosque. The Ottomans marched through the streets, not as destroyers, but as conquerors who understood the value of what they had taken. Constantinople became Istanbul, and the empire which had once ruled from Britannia to Egypt, from Gaul to Mesopotamia, breathed its last. And yet, even in death, Rome did not vanish. It lived on in the laws passed down to kingdoms and courts across Europe. It lived on in the language of science and the shape of churches. It lived in the architecture of cathedrals, in the organization of armies, in the dreams of emperors who had come centuries later and called themselves Caesars in Russian and German tongues. The idea of Rome had outlived the city itself. It had passed from myth to reality, and then back again. In the end, the Roman Empire had lasted for over 2,000 years. From the hills of a shepherd's village by the Tiber to the golden walls of Constantinople beside the Bosphorus, it had conquered, governed, adapted, and endured. It had written laws, raised gods, buried nations, and whispered across time that power could be eternal. But power never is. Only memory endures. Only memory endures. And so, the story of Rome, from a small settlement on the Tiber to the greatest empire the world had ever seen, reminds us how power rises, flourishes, and fades. Its legions, its emperors, its ideas, all echo through time. The stones may have crumbled, But the spirit of Rome endures in our laws, our cities, and our imagination. Empires come and go, but Rome never truly dies.